Speed Rail Authority, but pending my start date there, I come to you today still as Secretary of Transportation at the Transportation Agency, and joined right now by Jamie Metalka, who's with High Speed Rail and the Budget Officer.
Okay, that cooperation between the Department of Transportation and High Speed Rail. I mean, early debates were for it to be in the Transportation Department, so here we go. All right, thank you.
And as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, the 2019 Project Update Report came out recently on May 1st, and it reconfirms Governor Newsom's approach to high-speed rail, a vision he first laid out in the State of the State in February. That vision gets high-speed rail trains on the ground in the Central Valley as soon as possible, lives within our fiscal means, and remains committed to the vision of high-speed rail connecting to the Bay Area and Southern California. The Project Update Report addresses statutorily required reporting elements such as updates on cost, accomplishments, and risks. Additionally, this year's Project Update Report includes information that the authority committed to include at the time of last year's 2018 business plan. First, the 2018 business plan indicated a funding gap for the Valley-to-Valley segment. The update report also fully embraces the auditor's findings from the November 2018 audit, and we've adopted significant transparency, oversight, and management reforms at the authority. The administration has already made the project more transparent and accountable to the people by posting.
Based on some assumptions on cap and trade revenues, they estimate that they have $20.5 billion to $23.5 billion available. They estimate this is sufficient to do that Merced to Bakersfield line, as well as to do the other commitments that they talked about, the bookend projects, purchase trains, those types of things. So if you turn to page 9, you'll see a figure that lays out both the funding as well as the cost for the project. So next, they assume availability of additional funding for phase 1. So basically, they assume that there's enough money to complete that Merced to Bakersfield line and those associated commitments, but there's no identification of funding beyond that. So if you turn to page 10, we highlight some key issues for legislative consideration that follow from those key aspects of the plan. The first is that we believe that the success of the interim service depends on a variety of factors. So as I mentioned before, the early train operators modeling really assumed a number of things. It assumed things about what capital projects would be built, about sort of how the operations would be coordinated so that they would increase ridership. So if those don't come to pass, then we would expect that the revenues and that the ridership might not materialize the way that they expect. The second major issue for legislative consideration we wanted to highlight is that actual project costs associated with this project could be higher. Some of it is just intrinsic to doing a mega project. There's a lot of uncertainty there. There are also some specific uncertainties related to this project. Partly, should funding not materialize, schedules get pushed back, we would expect that would have some cost implications. And additionally, as I mentioned, they took this revised budgeting approach where now they're taking a less aggressive approach to setting that baseline budget. We think that makes sense, but they're only doing that for a segment of the project. They haven't applied that more conservative approach to the entire project. If they did, we would expect that the entire project's cost would also increase. And so we'd probably be looking at something beyond the $79.1 billion that is identified in the plan. Third, it's unclear if there's sufficient funding to complete Merced to Bakersfield. Part of this is because cost increases could occur on that segment. Also, some of the revenues might not materialize. So potentially the federal government could rescind the $3.5 billion or a portion of that $3.5 billion as they have threatened to do. It's unclear at this time whether that will occur. There's also some uncertainty naturally with cap and trade revenues, and so should those not materialize the way that they're expected, that would be also a risk there. If you turn to page 11, we continue with our issues for legislative consideration. The next one is that there's no funding plan beyond Merced to Bakersfield. So as I mentioned, really they focus on funding that Merced to Bakersfield line. They estimate they'll do that, but it's really unclear how we would fund the rest of the project. And so likely the general fund would have to, or some other similar source would have to cover a large portion of those costs. Fifth, the next issue to highlight here is that the legislature does have other options for moving forward. We continue to think this is a good opportunity for the legislature to step back, given that we're changing direction, given that there is this funding gap, think about what its priorities are, how it wants to proceed with the project, and really evaluate those different options. So they're not fully evaluated in the plan here. There are really a whole range of potential options that could be considered. We could do a smaller segment. We could do a bigger segment. We could do conventional diesel service. We could do electrified service that was less high speed. There's a whole range. There are probably trade-offs associated with all of those approaches. So those are the kinds of things the legislature may want to consider and consider discussing with the authority those different options. And then finally, the last issue that for legislative consideration starts on page 12. We highlight some key considerations that the legislature may want to keep in mind as it evaluates any and all of those potential options. So the first is cost. So that initial construction segment, as I indicated, is estimated to cost $12.4 billion at this time. Extensions to Merced and Bakersfield, if you combine those, add almost another $4 billion to the project. So the legislature will want to think about the different costs of the different options. The next issue is transportation benefits. So again, it's looking at, okay, well, for example, for those extensions, clearly they'll provide some additional transportation benefits. Are they sufficient to justify another $4 billion? Those are the kinds of questions the legislature is going to want to wrestle with. The next issue is the effect on local communities. So both the construction impacts, there's some disruption to local communities in many cases, as well as some economic benefits from the additional jobs. So there's some trade-offs there, and the different options will probably have different things to consider in that respect as well. And then finally, risks and uncertainties. These are, I think, also identified in your agenda really well, but there are a variety of different risks and uncertainties associated with the different options. They include potential differences in the amount of risk construction cost increases. The more ambitious the project, for example, probably we have more of those risks of cost increases, but also coordination with rail providers and other providers. There's probably some risks there. And then compliance with Proposition 1A and federal grant requirements are really some key risks and uncertainties that the legislature will probably have to weigh as it looks at the governor's proposed approach and weighs it against other options that are available. Happy to take any questions.
Members, questions. I did have a question for your early train operator, Secretary Innes, if you can invite them up here specifically. So my question was I have two questions. One was on the Caltrain electrification of the peninsula. When that is completed, the electrification, which should be before 2028, if everything goes right, would you be able to run test trains on that segment to determine the maximum speed that you could travel from San Francisco to Diridon Station? Let's just put it there.
You're good.
Okay, so specifically in this section...
you have to identify yourself first. So.
Okay, so my name is Jorge Rios. I am the project director of the early train operator. So talking about the speed in this section, since we have also all the crossings and we have all these restrictions in this highly dense, this highly populated section, so the speed that we can achieve will not be very different to the speed that Caltrain will achieve when everything is electrified. So we are talking that in this section we could potentially achieve around 110 miles per hour. So I don't know if this answered the questions.
Okay. No, but okay, so then the question is that would you run high-speed rail trains during this early period? Because again, the high-speed rail is not going to stop at every stop. So there's some coordination that would have to occur where everything would drop down and it would go from Diridon to, I guess, the airport, right? Right. Is the first. So
in the study, we assume that the high-speed service will stop. Will have a service only in 4 stations for the purpose of the study. So we assume that it will stop in Gilroy, in San Jose, Millbrae, and in San Francisco, Fort and King, in these 4 stations. So this is what we are assuming that we are going to stop. Since we are sharing the corridor with the Caltrain trains, so we will not be able to achieve, let's say, higher speeds in this section that they will achieve. even that our trains will be faster in this case. When we did the analysis to find out if it makes sense to do early operations in the peninsula without the connection through the Pacheco Pass to the high speed, we found out that our service cannot really be very different from the service that Caltrain will have in we assume that we could potentially open this service in 2028 for the purpose of the study. So we will not be able to really differentiate from the service that they will have without having the connection to the Central Valley. So more or less for your information, around 12% of the passengers which are willing to travel in the peninsula, from all the passengers, only around 12% are willing to travel between these 4 stations. So the impact that we can create in this section, it's not so big that make it. That it really makes sense to start something before the whole valley-to-valley connection is done.
My next question is that let's presume that the Madera-Fresno segment gets completed, that it's the track is done, and the construction is working on the Madera to Merced, and then Kings, Tulare, Bakersfield, but there is a segment done. Is it your expectation that you would be testing trains, or you just wait till the whole Merced to Bakersfield is done?
No, we could start testing way before the whole Merced to Bakersfield construction is done. So we can start the testing with a smaller section, and the trains will be tested, of course, and the tracking systems will be tested before we enter into actual revenue service. Even it's also aligned to the normal requirements for getting the certification for entry into passenger service. You need to achieve certain milestones to get the approval to run the trains.
Okay, great. There was a question that was laid out on the heavy reliance this is for Secretary Yanez, heavy reliance on consultants and the shift to more employees with the high-speed rail. Can you address that?
Sure, and that was something the state auditor had included in the November report as well. And there's a couple items here on the agenda that touch on that issue. There's a spring finance letter that requests to add state staff and delete consulting staff that are reviewing some of the contract work. That's consistent with the auditor's recommendation. So that's further in your agenda.
Yeah. I was just trying to get an idea, a big picture on timing. Is this a mid-year? Is this 20? When do you think that you've got these requests, and we have staff recommendation, at least on the security people, to approve it, but there is a major restructuring going on. Not major restructuring, but the reliance on consultants versus the reliance on employees.
Well, if the high-speed rail's already started some of the work of the advertising job description, so if the legislature approves the funding, we'll be able to start those positions. We're hoping in July we'll get some people on board for that tranche of it. And then the broader effort, the CEO's mentioned looking at really office by office, doing an evaluation to make sure the form fits the function, and seeing if there's other areas as well where it would be more appropriate to have state staff augmented and reduce the consulting resources. And that would be, something that would be would bring more to you probably next budget cycle next year.
Senator Monty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to go back to the electrification of Caltrain from San Francisco to San Jose. And then for any of you, the option of extension of that Caltrain electrification from San Jose to Gilroy. Sounds like high-speed rail is Gilroy to San Jose. It bypasses Morgan Hill. Caltrain serves Morgan Hill. How does that possible electrification extension to Gilroy fit into options that you might be looking at in terms of providing more immediate traffic relief and commuter service with the Caltrain route versus the high-speed rail service?
Sure. Yeah, let me address that. The business plan talked about looking more at both segments on the either side of Valley to Valley, including the Gilroy to San Francisco. So that was part of the ETO analysis. As was mentioned by the ETO, there's some, we think, more significant benefits in the prioritization to complete the Central Valley, but that Gilroy segment has benefits as well. So we're continuing our discussions with the freight operator on getting more access to that line, and that would benefit both Caltrain and ultimately high-speed rail. So the efforts continue to look at how to do that, but as far as the prioritization, I want to be clear, the project update report suggests the Central Valley is the higher priority and is fundable with the resources that we have through 2030.
Thank you. So how would you describe the status of those conversations with the rail provider from San Jose to Gilroy?
Well, we have had, I think we're having improved discussions. There was a period a few years ago where the freight operator said, no way, we don't even want to consider this. Now we're in discussions on what type of investments, would make that a consideration for them. And those are, I would describe them as positive. We do have some ways to go, but again, they're open to those discussions now, and we're having discussions on how we can.
And just as a representative of South Santa Clara County, there's high public interest in a more immediate, tangible benefit to residents of Santa Clara County. So I just hope you'll keep us posted of progress on those conversations. And wondering, does LAO, have you looked at that at all, the electrification from San Jose to Gilroy?
We haven't looked at that in detail. Certainly, as was noted, that's not currently a focus, but we think that's the kind of thing that would be appropriate as an option. I mean, clearly you could consider whether you wanted to include that in the project, or whether you wanted to include further work north in the Bay Area. Or if you spent less money on this project, that would free up money, to do other kinds of regional projects. So we haven't done an in-depth analysis at this time, but we think that's the kind of choice that the legislature is facing.
And again, back to the electrification from San Francisco to San Jose, that was a feature of the ballot proposition that California voters supported, and I don't think there's been necessarily good public education that is one of the immediate benefits, both environmentally and to commuter rail service of the high-speed rail bond. So I think people should be reminded of that at every possible turn. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Note that the East Bay, the Port of Oakland, and the railroads are in discussions regarding access from the port through where the ACE travels, and then going down to San Jose across there. So at least the railroad folks are at the table, which cannot always be said about what's going on. And it'll be interesting because that corridor continues down to Gilroy on that Niles route, or whichever the line is. So as long as they're at the table, those discussions make sense. Senator Stern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary, for coming in. This is maybe your last budget sub with this current hat on. So while I've still got you before us, and the LAO, I wanted to dig in a little bit on some of the issues raised around the lack of a funding plan on anything beyond Merced to Bakersfield here, and what you sort of see as the future. In Southern California, I know I'm on a committee with mostly my friends from the north, but the bulk of the vehicle miles traveled in this state and the bulk of the traffic, we know where it is. And in terms of displacing vehicle trips in this state, the corridors that are anticipated for that southern bookend have huge VMT displacement value. So I'm trying to figure out strategically, how did you guys land on this segment? Was it an economic development metric that sort of drove it? Was there a metric that drove it at all? I wanted to get your first thoughts on that.
Well, in terms of the Southern California investments, I think the state's always approached these not as an either or, not high-speed rail or commuter rail and intercity rail investments, but both. And of course, because of the cap and trade and the SB1 and high-speed rail bookends and money and other funding, there's about $4.4 billion in Southern California rail investments since 2012. So happy that, there are significant investments down there as well. As far as the high-speed rail analysis, the board had chosen the valley-to-valley as the best approach to getting high-speed rail up and running. And then this analysis that the ETO did was focused within that framework of looking at those two ends of valley-to-valley and determining where's interim service, where would that best benefit the state. So again,
Getting up and running, that was the goal to get, what's the quickest way to get it? You said up and running.
Yes, high-speed rail. In the Central Valley, that's where the trains can go the fastest. That's where the speed that's demanded with Prop 1A, where you achieve those highest speeds because of the flat areas with a lot of rural areas that the train's going through.
But not necessarily a VMT-driven analysis or a daily trip displacement or a greenhouse gas metric, more about the speed at which you can get to high speed?
Well, I guess multiple considerations, not just one, but certainly looking at the peninsula versus the Central Valley, the ETO's analysis would cover some of those items you mentioned. Ridership, what's the ridership gain? That gets to your VMT issue a bit. How many new riders are you bringing onto rail? There's also the emphasis on a segment that would test the high-speed rail trains at their maximum speed. So multiple considerations. Again, the focus consistent with the 2018 business plan was looking at the valley-to-valley segment.
And do you have a sense? Paint us as much of a picture as you can here going forward. I'm troubled by the lack of certainty right now, and I know there's a lot going on, so I just want to get this aired out. But I know there's still a $463 million contract pending down south that seems like there's intent but not execution yet. Update on that. I think that's in the Metrolink metro area on the bookends. Yeah. Is there an intent to see that through, even if it's not articulated in this budget laid out here?
Sure, absolutely. I believe you're talking about the Los Angeles Union Station project, the run-through tracks, and absolutely that is still part of this plan, is to adhere to those commitments to do the bookend projects, Caltrain, which is under construction already, but also the funding agreement to start flowing the Prop 1A bond funds to LA Union Station when that project goes to construction as well.
Timeline, sense on that?
Well, I believe as early as later this calendar year, those funding agreements, and those funding agreements are part of the provisions of Prop 1A that we have an independent consultant look at the funding agreement and come forward with those plans. So those are anticipated for later this calendar year.
It has to go through there's a study that still has to be done, or a consultant analysis before you all are going to...
Yeah, so to access, Russ Fong, Chief Financial Officer.
Yeah.
To access the Prop 1A funds, we have to do a funding C plan and a funding D plan that actually runs through your office. Part of the requirement for the funding D plan is we have to get an independent analysis on whether this plan actually makes sense. And that's what Secretary Addis is referring to.
So there's still a discretionary decision as to whether that makes sense.
Exactly.
That has not been decided by the Secretary or by the High Speed Rail Authority, whether it actually makes sense to follow through on those?
I think I could say that we think it makes sense. What we have to do is fulfill the Prop 1A statutory requirements, and those include this report with independent analysis that is shared with the legislature.
Third-party validation of our plan.
Okay, understood. And LAO, when you pointed out that the money sort of goes up to a point and then we don't really know what the future looks like, can you just elaborate on that?
Sure. So this plan identifies funding for that Merced to Bakersfield segment, and the authority has indicated this is a building block approach, and that ultimately I think the goal is to do more than that. But at this time, additional funding, I think it's going to be pretty tight just to even do the Merced to Bakersfield, and there's no funding that's been identified beyond that at this point. So that assumes, for example, all the funding, the cap and trade funding through 2030. That's sort of what's in current statute. It assumes that we keep the federal funding that's at risk, and it assumes all of the Prop 1A. So should the state want to move forward with a segment beyond Merced to Bakersfield, some additional funding sources are going to have to be identified. And those could be, perhaps the federal government will change its tune, although at this time that's unclear. Perhaps, other actions could be taken by the legislature to identify other funding sources and by the administration, but at this time there's no, or maybe private sector funding will come in, but at this point we have a lot of uncertainty about that.
So is that intentional? Are you trying to sort of leave yourself flexibility, or is it that the money's just not there? I mean, how do you respond to that sort of uncertainty going forward? I mean, how do I, going down to Los Angeles or down to San Diego or down to where most of the people in this state live who are stuck in traffic all day, how do we tell them that the high-speed rail is coming and that it's actually going to help them? I don't know how to tell them that if there was no money there.
Sure. Well, and
I mean, beyond, I know you're saying 1A.
Right.
But what we're not hearing GGRF, we're not hearing sort of another plan. So help me out here.
Sure, absolutely. Well, part of this plan is in some respects more conservative than prior plans in a couple of ways. So in the prior plan, we talked about extending cap and trade to 2050 from 2030. So we didn't count that revenue in this case. We looked at the authority we have through 2030. On the cost side, we increased the contingency by about $1 billion. So this was a very focused at looking at the money we have today. And I think the project's at a stage where delivery is critical. We need to deliver the construction we're doing in the Central Valley, ultimately deliver high-speed rail trains that are running on these segments to demonstrate the viability of the program. So there is a bit of an increased focus on those things. The governor said he still has that vision of the full system. It's difficult to move forward without a federal partner that's interested in continuing the funding. I believe in the future that's going to change. Maybe not immediately, but there's many states that are interested in high-speed rail. And I think with changing technology in the transportation sector, I think high-speed rail makes even more sense. And, commuter rail and other rail systems make even more sense than ever. So, I'm long-term optimistic that, we keep building, but having again, developing that increased credibility from the delivery, I think is key now. And so that's why we're focused on that at this point in time.
And this question about additional environmental approvals or analyses needed on the bookend side of things, can you comment on that issue? Do you think that how many steps away are we from actually being able to go back to Southern California and be like, this is definitely going to happen, as opposed to like, we got to wait for a new administration or a change in the attitude there or additional funding materializing? Like, okay, beyond securing the funding, is there also a rigorous sort of multiple hoops we've got to jump through on CEQA or other fronts right now?
Well, for the Los Angeles Union Station project, that initial scope through initial construction has received full funding, both through the high-speed rail bookend funding, but also through one of these transit intercity rail capital program, the SB1 cap and trade grants. But it is in the middle of the environmental stage right now. LA Union Station LA Metro is the sponsor of the environmental process, and they have gone forward with, as High Speed Rail has, with the CEQA First strategy. Okay. So they've put out the CEQA documents, advancing those. There's some difficulty with the federal government.
I was going to ask you about NEPA, yeah. So some way to streamline based on CEQA in theory, if you could tear off that, and is that? Yeah, well, what's optimal is to do them at the same time, and lack of engagement with by the federal government is causing a risk here.
including the LA Union Station project, but they're pursuing the CEQA First strategy to advance that side of it. Longer term, we have, I think more than a year ago, submitted the information to the Federal Railroad Administration requesting NEPA assignment for California, which is a streamlining measure. It's something that Caltrans enjoys for highway and road projects since I think about 2006. And it's a significant savings of time, which then results in a significant savings of money. And so we've applied for that. Unfortunately, about August of last year, the federal government really discontinued doing their environmental NEPA work on the high-speed rail project and has not granted the NEPA assignment either. So we're stuck right now, and that's why the project update report devotes significant amount of print to talking about federal risk.
So I would just wrap up and thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Chair, and for yours, Mr. Secretary. The more we can do, I get the federal risk, the more we can do to show some light at the end of the tunnel for all of Southern California, that at least that there's an intent, and I appreciate working on the run-through. There are other issues, too, in the area on the bookends, right? Not just run-through. There's all the upgrades through that, various lines going through the region. I still believe in getting to San Diego. And I truly think, when you look at the 405 freeway, that is the most trafficked freeway on the planet, cumulatively. So help us, anything I can do to work with you guys to help us articulate that vision down south, because we don't want this to sort of lose the constituency down there. I get project execution and delivery, but some way to at least have a contingent plan or sort of articulating what that could look like if, say, X dollars materialize or if X federal approvals were granted. I think that would be very helpful. So just for your consideration, I would appreciate that. Thank you, and thank you.
Senator McGuire.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you. Thank you so much to the LAO as well. I'm going to be quick in regards to, I just want to confirm on the San Joaquin line. There's still needing to be conversations to be able to flush out the leasing of that line, right? And then also, what happens to our subsidy that we put into that line longer term? So can you just bring us up to date one more time on the San Joaquin side of the line coming into the Bay?
Sure. Well, I think alluding to the proposal to work with these partners, high-speed rail cannot run a service that requires an operating subsidy, but the existing commuter lines, the existing intercity rail lines today receive operating support. And so what the early train operator looked at was how that would change with and without high-speed rail. So looking at both ACE San Joaquin's and the high-speed rail service, as well as the existing connecting bus service, the ETO estimated that the operating subsidy would actually fall with the advent of high-speed rail. So it would fall from about $83 million a year without to about $63 million a year with high-speed rail being added to that section. And that's because ridership grows substantially. And so with that, you have a greater fare box recovery, and that's covering a greater proportion of the cost.
Got it. Okay. And to be able to go on the San Joaquin side, the non-high-speed rail side, I'll say, there are still discussions happening about that longer-term lease, correct?
You said longer-term needs?
Lease.
Lease. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So there's more work to do with the partners, but somewhat analogous to the Caltrain segment in that Prop 1A envisions other passenger rail providers having access and use of the high-speed rail infrastructure. And so we would continue working with our partners, San Joaquin's ACE, on how they could access the high-speed rail infrastructure to provide that service.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Grateful.
I got a follow-up question on my administrative cap with Prop 1A. We know that you're at some time going to have to be coming back to us on the increase of the cap if we go ahead and we move consultants to regular staff. Do you have an idea on that timing?
Yeah, so at our current admin budget of $47 million, we will anticipate running out at our current rate fiscal year 2021. So we do have to work with Department of Finance to figure out a plan. Now, we do have the ability to increase our 2.5% cap to 5%. If that's the case and we do get the 5%, if we kept at the $47 million admin budget, that would probably get us out to fiscal year 26-27.
Okay. All right. And then let's just play a game. The chair here has been an advocate of increasing the allowances on the cap and trade. I'll continue to be tenacious if Mary Nichols is listening on this. So let's just walk me through this. Let's just say that as the legislature is successful, that the cap and trade revenues go from $3 billion to $6 billion, then to $9 billion. So that the High-Speed Rails Authority goes to another $1.5 billion a year. Okay, and let's just say that. And so if we project that out for 10 years, that's $15 billion. We're $60 billion short. So the question would be, I don't know if you have an answer right now, is that the shortfall is still there, even in the chair's most aggressive scenario on high-speed rail, which would be a steady flow of money. How do we close the other $45 billion gap? So that's the first question. And then the second question, which I'm sure my colleagues would like to know, is that what you're thinking under the new plan, where would that extra money go? Would that be to the bookends in Los Angeles, to the Gilroy segment, or to Palmdale? What would, if you only got a quarter of what you needed, what would be, from your analysis, because I assume you looked at lots of scenarios, so there was the scenario you chose was number one, but number 2 and 3, how would that work in?
Sure. Well,
the game we're playing.
Yeah.
First of all, I would take that increase in cap and trade and use that. So, a couple things to think about. So let me talk about what we know for sure today. So we have 2 scenarios in our 16 business plan, 18, and the current project update report. We're estimating at the low end, if we were to get $500 million in cap and trade to 2030, we would have about $20.4 billion for the entire project. If that cap and trade comes in at 750, and that's our higher scenario, we would have about $23.45 billion. That's a pretty substantial increase. So now when you're talking about $1 billion, you can just see how this accumulates. The challenge again with cap and trade is we don't know what it comes in. And I would encourage you to also look at some type of stability in the program, because the fluctuation of cap and trade is a little difficult for a project this large. One year we might get a big bulk of it, twice as much as we planned. The other, another year it could come in quite a bit less. So obviously a higher cap would be wonderful for the project and it would close the gap. But I also would encourage you to look at some type of stability in the fluctuation of what we get every single year. That's really the key to be able to plan this project, is how much actual cash we're going to get per year.
Well, getting into a great discussion, part of that was the extension to 2030 and the cushion of a 2/3 vote, that people thought that the uncertainty was released. I guess the following is, Secretary Innes, is that what should we be looking at if we go forward with this delivery of an operating segment? What would be next in the logical sequence, and what should we be looking for when we talk to these people in Los Angeles about when it's coming?
Well, I'd certainly mention, too, that the cap and trade rising is maybe a rising water line that lifts other votes, too, including the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program that receives money there. So, that is I think, funded for example, the Metrolink, about $1 billion in the last round. So that helps on multiple scores. But according the 2018 business plan looked at again the valley to valley and indicated the Gilroy to San Francisco and the Central Valley, and then bridging that gap, that Gilroy to Madera gap, as the what's currently at that time was listed as the major funding piece that we wanted to focus on. But again, I would say, statewide, the rail modernization approach and the including our commuter and intercity is the right way to go, because for these systems to work and achieve the air quality benefits, the VMT reduction, you need a network of rail that connects to each other. And high-speed rail is that backbone, but you need those connecting pieces to grow significantly as well.
Just an informational item, no action is required, so let's move on to issue number 8, which is your IT security request of 5 permanent positions and